I want to talk about some players from, or at least kind of relate back to the World Cup a little bit. Now that the season is basically nearing the end and we're heading to the Champions League final here, a couple of names that were very prevalent during the World Cup and some who didn't even play in the World Cup are playing in this Champions League final. And the three that really come to my mind is Lautaro Martinez, who didn't have a great World Cup, Romelu Lukaku, who also didn't have a great World Cup, and Erling Haaland, who didn't play in the World Cup. But this is kind of what we were looking at when it comes to Erling Haaland missing the World Cup, is that, well, he's probably going to be doing just fine and he's going to be healthy and ready to go. I bring up Lautaro and Lukaku because, again, they didn't have great World Cups, and that doesn't mean that you can't perform and be successful. Where Lautaro Martinez in the final had his best game of the World Cup. Is this that we're nearing the end of the busiest season and most packed season, I guess, for a lot of players? How much of an impact do you think the World Cup had on these players here when two of them weren't that great in the World Cup and one didn't even play in the World Cup? Good. That's what
I'll
I was
answer
thinking
I'll
too.
answer this. I'll answer this from like a player perspective. I think that when your schedule is super, super packed, it's very, very hard in terms of fatigue and injury to stay, at your prime level.
Yeah.
But I always, always, always said when I played, I'd rather have too much in my schedule than not enough. Haaland is a superhuman cheat code. We've talked about it so many times on this podcast. He could be at the World Cup or not, and he's still going to excel. Like, obviously, he's breaking records and he wasn't at the World Cup. But I also think, like, for Martinez, for example, where he got a lot of criticism in Qatar, it's just been a jam-packed schedule. He had a lot on his plate. He didn't probably perform the way he wanted to at the World Cup, but he's still going, right? Like, he's still in stride. He's still finding his form, and I think he's been killing it with Inter, right? Like, he's a guy that I'm like, yo, you're on the wrong Milan. Come to AC Milan. Get away from Inter. So it's tough sometimes when you have too much on your plate. Sometimes it's better when you have less, but I always preferred more. But also in a season that's so packed with games and tournaments and opportunities, like, it's okay for people and players to kind of have a slump. Like, we saw Lewandowski have a slump, and all the Barca fans were down his throat because they're like, he hasn't scored a goal in this amount of games. I'm like, he's the leading goal scorer in La Liga. Like, what do you guys want from him? Like, he's still leading the league in goals. He just came back from a World Cup. He's probably tired. Give him like 2 weeks rest. Give him some time to adjust. It's not easy to adjust from club to international, back to club, from World Cup to Champions League. Like, these are all different stakes, different teams, different managers, different styles of football. Players need to be given a little bit more grace.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a really good point too, is like players slump. And I think I'm certainly guilty of it too, but I think we tend to forget that these are professionals, these are players, they should always be playing up to the standards that I expect them to be playing up to. But again, their slumps are obviously human, and you're going to see slumps at certain times, even if that is underneath the biggest microscope of the season, right? So yeah, I think that's a really sobering reality that people need to remember as well.
Yeah. I mean, they're human at the end of the day. And of course, I always say you can hold these big superstars to high expectations. I always think about Neymar and Mbappe and Messi at PSG. PSG fans are allowed to feel like, hey, these guys are superstars and they should be doing so much better than what we saw in the first and second leg of the Champions League versus Bayern Munich, right? This story is like a repeating story for PSG. But at the end of the day, right, like, they are also human. Maybe Neymar's battling an injury, which we saw his ankle was like the size of a globe at the World Cup. Do you know what I mean? Like, Mbappe can't do everything on his own. Messi can't do everything on his own. Maybe they have stuff going on. That's why you can like hold players to a high expectation, but I think that there's a fine line with them being disrespected. Like, I do think that Neymar and Messi were heavily disrespected by PSG fans. So it's just kind of like this fine line of being like, man, I wish, this player did better today. I think, I wish Rashford had a better game versus like Rashford sucks. He's the worst player in the entire world. I can't believe it, right? Like there's just such a fine line.
So many prisoners of the moment.
Yes, exactly. Like sometimes football fans can get like I feel for Lewandowski because I'm like Barcelona fans were so quick to be like get out of our club and I'm like he's your leading goal scorer.
Yeah, how are you going to replace
like,
that?
Yeah,
who are you going to sign?
Yeah, I'm like, what do you want? I'm like, that's probably the reason why you guys managed to stay at the top of the table and now win La Liga.
Especially in world football, there's like a very low supply of top strikers who can score like Lewandowski. I mean, you have Osimhen.
Yes.
Then who do you have? Right, like Lukaku, maybe. These type of strikers are very sought out and it's extremely hard to find. And that's why Erling Haaland, Manchester City really wanted. They needed a striker who can consistently score, and clearly they didn't really need him to score today. But it's always good to have that striker up front. And look at Benzema, like he's so important to Real Madrid because he can score a lot of goals.
Yeah,
that's why Manchester United, in my opinion, have struggled. Not struggle, but like if they had a more powerful goal scorer, they would probably be higher in the table, I think.
Bringing up Manchester United once again. Anything to make us feel better about not being in the Champions League final, but I can't believe that we're already at the Champions League final of the season. Even though we just talked about how busy the schedule was, the World Cup, all these domestic leagues, the Nations League, the CONCACAF, everything that we've dealt with and went through so far, the finish line is in sight.